The cat that followed me for days. When I looked at his collar, I got chills. On a cold night in October 2019, James Peterson walked hurriedly through the bright streets of New York. The office hours had been tiring, and all he wanted was to get to his small apartment in Brooklyn quickly. The streets were wet from the light drizzle that had been falling since the early afternoon, reflecting the lights from the streetlights and the signs of the stores that were still open. Cars passed by at high speed, honking impatiently at busy intersections in the city that never sleeps. James was never the type to pay attention to small details around him. His route was always the same. He left work on Fifth Avenue, turned a few corners, took the subway, and walked the last few blocks home. But that night, something different caught his attention. On the curb of a not very busy street, a black and white cat was sitting, watching him intently. Its eyes glowed in the yellow streetlights, and its tail moved gently from side to side. James looked quickly, without paying much attention, and continued walking. But when he turned the corner, he felt a slight discomfort. He looked back, and there was the cat, walking silently behind him, keeping a safe distance. He ignored it. Maybe it was just any stray cat looking for food or shelter from the cold. But the next night, when leaving work and walking the same route, the cat appeared again, and the next day, and the other. It was impossible for it to be just a coincidence. The idea of being followed by an animal every night began to bother James. The cat never tried to get too close, never meowed or acted aggressive. I just followed him. He watched your every step, as if he was waiting for something. On the fourth day, James decided to act. When he noticed the cat appearing once again in the middle of the path, he stopped and waited. The feline, hesitant at first, gained courage and slowly approached. Only then did James notice a detail that had gone unnoticed in previous days. The cat was wearing a thin, worn-out collar with a small medallion attached to it. Curious, he bent down and carefully picked up the pendant between his fingers. His hands were cold, but a shiver ran through his body when he noticed the locket opening. Inside it was a small, folded piece of paper. James took a deep breath and unfolded the note. The handwriting was hurried, almost shaky, as if it had been written in desperation. Only a short sentence was there, but it was enough to make your heart race. Have you ever been in a situation where an animal seemed to be trying to tell you something? Have you ever had the feeling that a cat or dog knew more than they let on? Tell me here in the comments. I want to know your story. I will. Tell you this story in detail. Every day, James would leave work around 8 in the evening, cross the busy block, dodge the tourists crowding the sidewalks, and enter the nearest subway station. When he arrived in Brooklyn, he walked the last few blocks to his apartment. Nothing in his routine was out of the ordinary. Nothing caught his attention until that cat shows up. The first time he saw him was on a corner near a Chinese restaurant that he used to pass by on his route. The feline was sitting on a manhole cover, watching the movement around. His black and white fur stood out in the yellow streetlight, and his eyes glowed a deep amber. James looked away quickly, without paying much attention, and continued walking. But when he looked back a few meters later, he realized that the cat had left its place and was now walking silently behind him. He didn't call. Stray cats roamed the city all the time. Maybe it was just heading in the same direction. But then, the next night, it happened again. James turned the same corner, and there he was, sitting in the same place, waiting. As James passed by, the cat got up and began following him once more. He kept a safe distance, never getting too close, but his eyes were fixed on him in an almost disconcerting way. On the third day, the scene repeated itself. Now, James was starting to get uncomfortable. Cats weren't like that. They were independent, unpredictable. This one, however, seemed determined to follow him home, night after night. He tried to ignore it, but his subconscious was already restless. Something felt wrong. A coincidence can happen once or twice, but 3 days in a row. It was too strange. It was on the 4th day that James decided to test whether it was just paranoia or whether, in fact, that cat was intentionally following him. He changed his route, cutting along a parallel street. He discreetly looked back and saw the cat standing on the sidewalk, watching him. Then, to his surprise, he started walking again, following his new route. The discomfort grew. It was impossible for it to be just a fluke. That cat wasn't just wandering around aimlessly. He was behind James, and he seemed to have a purpose. It was that night that James finally decided to act. That night James walked slower than usual. His day had been tiring, and his mind was still processing that cat's insistence. The bitter cold of autumn made dry leaves pile up on the sidewalks, and the wind pushed old newspaper paper through the city's dark alleys. Traffic was already calmer, and the streets, once crowded with hurried pedestrians, now seemed almost empty. As he turned the usual corner, he didn't need to look. The cat was there, sitting on a ventilation grill, watching him with the same indecipherable expression. His eyes shone brightly under the dim streetlight lighting, but this time James didn't look away or ignore the animal's presence. He stopped. The cat remained motionless for a few moments, but when it realized that it had finally attracted its attention, it slowly got up and began to walk towards James. Its footsteps were silent, and its tail moved slowly, as if it was studying. The man's reaction, there was something strange in the way he approached, as if he already knew that this was the moment he was waiting for. James ducked, not knowing exactly why. Maybe it was the cat's insistence, maybe it was the curiosity growing inside him, or maybe it was just instinct telling him that there was something wrong there. Only when the animal was close enough for him to see the details of its fur did he noticed the thin collar around its neck. She looked old and worn, a sign that this cat was not simply a stray. With his hands still a little shaky from the cold, James reached out and gently touched the medallion attached to his collar. He felt the cold metallic surface against his skin. The pendant was small and antique-looking, but it had a discreet clasp on the side. Without thinking much, James slid his fingernail into the slot and opened it. What he found inside made his heart race. A folded piece of paper was inside, small but carefully placed in the tight space of the locket. He took the note, feeling a slight shiver run down his spine before he even read it. When he unfolded the crumpled sheet of paper and saw the hurried, slightly shaky handwriting, his chest tightened. "Please follow me, I need help." James felt his breath hitch for a moment. The cold night air felt even colder now, and his body reacted automatically with a shiver that ran up the back of his neck. His eyes returned to the cat, who was now watching him expectantly. There was no longer any doubt. That animal was trying to take him somewhere. Without hesitation, James stood up and took the first step. The cat turned on its paws and began to walk in front, leading him along the narrow sidewalk. James didn't know what he would find, but one thing was certain: that night was about to change his life forever. James followed the cat without hesitation. At every step he tried to rationalize what he was doing, but no explanation made any sense. He was tired, it was late, and the idea of following a cat through the streets of New York seemed absurd, but something inside him compelled him to continue. The cat moved quickly but without running, as if it knew James was close behind. He cut paths, crossed narrow streets, and passed through dimly lit alleys, deftly avoiding the piles of garbage bags and the shadows cast by old buildings. James felt the cold air hit his face as he explored areas he had never explored before. The journey took about 10 minutes. The city still had life, but there, in that farthest part, the streets were silent. The cat turned a corner and stopped in front of an old house at the end of a dead-end street. James felt a shiver as he looked. At the worn facade, the windows were closed, the curtains were covered in dust, and the mailbox was overflowing with old letters and crumpled pamphlets. The surrounding atmosphere felt heavy. James approached slowly, feeling his heart racing. The cat sat in front of the door, as if waiting for him to do something. It was then that he heard it, a faint sound coming from inside the house, a murmur. James stopped, trying to understand if that was just his imagination, but then he heard it again, a low sound, almost a whisper, interrupted by the sound of something scraping against the floor. Someone was inside. James's instinct was screaming at him to turn around and leave, but he couldn't. The cat wouldn't have taken him there by chance. Swallowing his anxiety, he walked up the steps and knocked on the door. No response. He knocked again, this time harder. Just silence. But the cat remained motionless, staring at him. James looked around, trying to decide what to do. The faint noise inside the house indicated that someone was there, but why was there no answer? He tried the handle. Locked. His mind worked fast, trying to find a solution. It was then that he realized the gravity of the situation. If someone inside needed help, they might be unable to respond. His heart was pounding. He took out his cell phone and with slightly shaking fingers dialed the police. He didn't know what he was about to find, but something told him that this cat had just guided him to something much bigger than he imagined. James remained still for a few seconds, feeling the tension build around him. The cat continued to sit in front of the door, its gaze conveying something almost indescribable, as if it knew that James was about to make a decision that would change everything. The faint sound inside the house persisted, and with each new muffled murmur, his uneasiness grew. He needed to act. Taking his cell phone from his pocket, he quickly dialed the emergency number. The wait for assistance seemed like an eternity, but as soon as he managed to report the situation, he was informed that a vehicle was on the way. James didn't know what to find inside, but something told him it wasn't just a coincidence. The minutes passed slowly. The cold wind bit the skin, and dry leaves swirled across the deserted sidewalk. The cat, impassive, remained next to the door without showing any intention of leaving. When the police car's headlights illuminated the deserted street, James felt momentary relief, but he still had no idea what he was about to witness. Two police officers got out of the car and walked towards him. James quickly explained the situation. As one of the officers approached the door and tried to call someone inside, no response. They hit harder. Silence. The faint sound, now more noticeable, was still coming from inside the house. One of the officers took a step back and, with a precise movement, forced the handle. The door gave way with a long, dragging creak, revealing a dark and oppressive environment. The smell of dust and damp filled the air as the light from the flashlights cut through the darkness inside the house. On the living room floor, among old furniture and scattered boxes, was an elderly woman. Her fragile body lay motionless, and her pale skin indicated the suffering of the last few days. Officers quickly approached, assessing his condition. She was breathing, but with difficulty. Dehydrated and weakened, she seemed to have been there too long. The cat, which until then had been at James's side, slowly entered the house, stopping next to the woman. He curled up next to her, as if trying to warm her with his own presence. James watched the scene in silence, feeling a lump form in his throat. Paramedics arrived shortly after. They examined the woman, checking her vital signs and preparing her to be transported to the hospital. The entire time, the cat remained by her side without leaving for a single moment. As the team loaded her onto the stretcher and carried her out, James felt a weight in his chest. He had never imagined that a simple stray cat could lead him to something so significant. If he hadn't followed that animal, if he had ignored the note, perhaps that lady would never have been found in time. When the ambulance drove away, James stood on the sidewalk, watching the car drive away. Beside him, the cat was looking in the same direction. At that moment, James realized that none of this had been by chance. Fate put him there, and that cat was living proof that sometimes help can come in the most unexpected ways. James stood on the sidewalk, watching the ambulance disappear over the horizon. The cold night seemed even quieter now, as if the world around him had slowed down. Beside him, the cat remained motionless, eyes fixed on the spot where the vehicle had disappeared. It was as if he knew that his mission was not yet over. The distant sound of sirens faded, and James felt an unusual weight in his chest. He was never a sentimental person, nor someone who believed in meaningful coincidences. But there he was, in the middle of the deserted street, trying to process what had just happened. If he hadn't followed that cat, Margaret probably wouldn't have made it another day. The thought hit him hard, and he wondered how many times in his life he had ignored little signs around him. The cat, as if sensing the change in his thoughts, took a small step forward and looked at James. There was something in his gaze that seemed almost human, a mixture of relief and expectation. For the first time, James really saw that animal, not as just any cat, but as something much bigger. Minutes passed, and James realized he couldn't just walk away and leave the cat there, alone. He bent down and tentatively extended his hand, waiting for the animal to move away. But to his surprise, the cat stayed still. His black and white fur contrasted with the damp concrete of the sidewalk, and his eyes remained fixed on him. The decision was natural. James got up, looked at the empty house once more, and started walking. The cat followed him without hesitation, as if that were the inevitable outcome of this story. As they crossed the dark street, James realized that somehow his life would never be the same. Over the next few months, Margaret recovered well, but her condition required constant care. Her family, who lived in another state, decided that the best thing for her would be to move to a nursing home where she could receive the assistance she needed. It was a difficult goodbye, but Margaret knew she had no choice. What hurt most, however, was leaving behind the cat that accompanied her for so many years. James, who was following everything closely, realized that he couldn't just leave him in the empty house or allow him to be taken to a shelter. That cat wasn't just any animal. He had saved a life. He had found James in the crowd and somehow knew he was the right person to help. Without hesitation, James made a decision that would change his life forever. He adopted the cat. He took him to his apartment, prepared a space for him, and, for the first time in years, he felt that his house was different. There was a new presence there, something he never imagined he would need, but now seemed essential. Over time, James began to notice small changes in his own routine. When I got home from work, I never went back to a silent apartment. Now the cat was waiting for him at the door, just as he used to wait for Margaret. When he sat down to read or watch TV, the animal would settle down next to him, purring softly, as if everything was exactly as it should be. James never believed in signs or in something bigger guiding our lives, but when he watched that cat sleeping peacefully on the couch, he began to wonder if it was all just a coincidence. Maybe animals could see what we couldn't. Maybe somehow that cat knew that James needed him as much as he needed James. And you? Have you ever had a moment when an animal seemed to be trying to warn you about something? Have you ever felt like your cat or dog knew more than they let on? Tell me here in the comments. I would love to read your story. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. In the next video, I will tell an even more impressive story. You can't miss it.